Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to address the Sustainable Food System Summit in Turkey. Greetings from Brussels, where FoodDrink Europe is based. My name is Dirk and I'm Director General of FoodDrink Europe. And I will, in the next 15 to 20 minutes, lead you through how the European food and drink industry is navigating the stormy weathers of today. And I'm very pleased to do so in this respectable audience that I have in front of me today. So a little bit about FoodDrink Europe first. We are the organization for the European food and drink manufacturing industry. We celebrated our 40th anniversary this year, and we are based in Brussels and a reference point for the EU and international organizations when it comes to the food industry voice. Our members are national food and drink federations from the EU countries, plus Norway and the United Kingdom. We have also sector organizations at EU level, which represent different categories such as coffee, snacks, starch, beer, and so forth. And we also have large multinational companies that are leading companies in our organization, such as Ulker, for instance, but also the likes of Cargill, Ferrero, and so forth. So this is an important network where we shape the food industry's direction, and the direction that we are shaping is very much in function of sustainable food systems. If you look at our industry in figures, we are the largest manufacturing sector of Europe in terms of turnover, in terms of employment, and in terms of value added. We're also the largest exporter of food in the world, and the third largest importer of food. We have very flourishing relations with Turkey. The imports from Turkey into the EU amount to 2.9 billion euros, and that is only going up and up. If you compare the figures from 2021 to 2017, there is a 21% increase in Turkish exports of agri-food products into the EU. And likewise, also imports from the EU into Turkey are also going up, and 9% since 2017. So I think that reaffirms that the relations between the EU and Turkey are strong when it comes to agri-food. And I think particularly in these crisis times, it's important to uphold that and to strengthen those relations. We are now in an unprecedented time of different crises, and where we thought maybe that the COVID pandemic would be almost over, there are still parts in the world that are struggling with the disease, with the pandemic itself, and that also has an impact on the way we as an industry source our products. If you look at the closure of markets in China, if you look at some of the borders that were closed, some of the shocks that we are now actually experiencing in terms of demand, the impact of the pandemic is not over yet for our industry. Of course, we've been dealing with the war in Ukraine since March or end of February. But there are also other geopolitical tensions in the world that are making food systems very fragile. And we have seen how vulnerable food supply and food production can be in this geopolitical world. Obviously, linked to that is also the cost inflation that our industry experiences. And I think this goes for all of us in a global setting. It's not only about rising energy costs, which at the moment in Europe is very much a critical issue, where companies are sometimes faced with bills that are 4, 5, 6 times higher than normal, and energy can sometimes make up 60 to 70% even of the cost of production. So energy uncertainty is really an issue at the moment in Europe. There are measures being taken to mitigate the high energy prices, but also the access to energy in that sense. But again, it's not only energy, it's also packaging. If you look at container shipping rates that were during the COVID pandemic up by some 400% globally, This has now come down a little bit, but we are not yet before COVID levels. That is not something that we have arrived yet. So prices remain high also on transportation, things like packaging, where you see that the cost of things like paper or cardboard, wooden containers has gone up. We've done some estimations, and if you compare the prices of July this year with the prices of last year, they've gone up by 35%. So this is also an enormous challenge for companies. So companies in Europe are increasingly under pressure. We have signs that if there are further economic shocks on top of the shocks that we already have today, then companies will default, will have to stop production, and we're seeing those first signals. So we're really in peculiar times. And of course, that also translates into inflation pressures on consumer prices, on food prices, and that is, of course, not beneficial for society. Lastly, I think that the silent killer in the room is climate change. And we had a very terrible summer with a lot of droughts, but we are seeing more and more in the world, the global degradation of our environment having an impact on food production. So if harvests are not good, this has a direct impact on the entire value chain. So climate change is becoming more visible, becoming more of an issue as we speak. And indeed, I think we are at the time where there's more and more recognition that global food insecurity and energy insecurity linked to that is becoming much more of an issue. If you look at the rate of people that are going to bed hungry every night, this is only increasing because of the conflicts that we're having, because of the cost pressures, because of the measures that have to be taken in the context of pandemic, but also the vulnerabilities that climate change show. So it's a perfect storm of different crises that might be actually permanent to some extent, and where we need to be prepared for. And if not, we risk increased hunger, we risk increased social unrest, and that is obviously something that we need to avoid at all costs. So if you look at impacts that we have faced over all of these crises, then it's in relation to inputs. Our sector needs reliable quality and quantity of agricultural raw materials. If we don't have sufficient sunflower oil, which was an issue at the start of the war, then we need to find alternatives. Are these alternatives available? Are they affordable? And how can we divert our sourcing in that respect? Energy, if food production cannot rely on energy, there is no food production. So it's a 24/7 operation in many factories. You cannot just stop and cut the electricity because that can have food safety consequences, sustainability, food waste consequences. So it is very important that we can continue producing, and packaging, as I mentioned. But it's also about markets. And we saw in the COVID pandemic how certain channels were closed. The hospitality sector, certain export markets were not available anymore. And of course, that has led to a lot of barriers to trade, also in the form of export restrictions by countries that have decided to unilaterally close their markets or their borders for trade of certain goods. We saw, for instance, the palm oil ban in Indonesia, just as an example. But we also faced logistical bottlenecks. Where do we reroute if we can no longer source and supply to countries like Russia, where now there's a ban in place? So this has of course a lot of implications for us. But another item that should not be forgotten is labor. We have enormous labor shortages in the sector that needs to be dealt with, but it is also a matter of getting the people, the right workers, in the right places, which was sometimes an issue because of borders being closed. So there are a lot of supply chain implications, but also economic and financial implications for companies, and also political, because I think we have realized, particularly with the war, how important it is to also look at the geopolitical dimension when we talk about ESG. So in the short term, we've been asking for a couple of measures that are needed for emergency crisis management. So first of all, the food and drink sector should be seen as a priority when it comes to energy security, first and foremost. And we have to have access to gas, electricity, also renewable sources of energy, but there needs to be sufficient quantities of energy in order to produce food. And that's not only for the food and drink industry, it's also for the farmers, it's also for other parts in the ecosystem. We also need support for the small companies that cannot even stay above the water. That is very logical today. And we need flexibility, because if you need to source your ingredients differently, we cannot constantly adapt labels. You need to also see where we can have a bit of flexibility in importing certain commodities or certain ingredients at different standards in a bit more flexible way in this crisis period. In the EU, we have, of course, a lot of countries that still have borders. So we need to ensure that there are green lanes that trade across countries can continue. And we really, at the international level, need countries to refrain from imposing export bans or restrictions, because food is very interdependent. Supply chains are very global in many cases. So we do rely on uninterrupted trade. And of course, reducing administrative burden to make it easier for food companies to operate. Now, if you look at the longer term, I think it's critical that food is higher on the political agenda. Food needs to be seen as a strategic sector and societally essential in that sense. Food, like without food, you don't have a life. So the food sector needs to be much more regarded and recognized as important for whichever situation that we're in. All these crises somehow are linked to food, and food plays a major role. So we need to have much more support from policymakers in seeing us as essential. Another important bit, and I think there's a learning from the crisis, is that we need to diversify. Companies need to diversify their risks. We need to diversify crops. We cannot just rely on wheat or on corn or on just a few crops. We need to look at a broader spectrum to also to feed the planet that is with a growing population. We need to diversify trade. We cannot just do business with one country, but we need to look at who are our reliable partners. And I think there also Turkey and the EU should work much more closely together to build and further strengthen the relationship in the agri-food sector. But it's also about diets. There's no one-size-fits-all diet. There's no one-size-fits-all food system. So we need to diversify in order to avoid that we are reliant on a single source, a single ingredient, a single country. And of course, we need to accelerate now the green and digital transition. It's very obvious that we could have avoided a lot of these problems if we would be prepared. We would not be so reliant on fossil fuels. If we would be already moving towards nature positive solutions, but also looking at upholding productivity and food security. And it's that discussion that is now being held here in Brussels, but I think everywhere in the world, on how to match the short-term crisis management needs with the long-term Green Deal and sort of sustainability vision. And I think as companies in the food and drink industry, I think there's certainly a shift that you can see. Consumers increasingly are interested in sustainability, healthy, sustainable choices. And if you look at sort of what is influencing their purchasing decisions, of course, taste, of course, costs are still very high up. They are the first factors why consumers buy products, but also health, sustainability from an environmental point of view, they play a bigger and bigger role. So that's an important. It's also reputational because citizens expect that farmers, that producers are playing a role in making systems more sustainable. So here in Europe, 9 out of 10 consumers, citizens believe that farmers and manufacturers should play an important role in this respect. There's also the regulatory direction that we have here in the EU with the European Green Deal, with the farm to fork strategy. I'll come back to that in a while. But there's also a business incentive because we see that companies that are investing in sustainability are generally more profitable, and there are new market opportunities out there. Now, just to let you know that we have this Green Deal where a lot of regulation and policies are coming from. I don't want to go too much into the detail now, but just to let you know that we have in the European Union set our mindset on the objective to be climate neutral by 2050. And within that, there's a lot of activity ongoing and a lot of measures that are going to come for the food industry that should help to go into that direction. So only for this year and for a little bit into next year, we expect proposals on targets on packaging and packaging waste, like recycling targets. We expect also legally binding food waste measures in the EU member states. So we will be asked to contribute to food waste reduction. There are consumer information initiatives on front of pack nutrition labeling and so forth. And you may have heard that there's this discussion on whether it should be a Nutri-Score or another different type of labeling system. And of course, also on the environmental and social sustainability side, there's a lot of work ongoing in due diligence, how to work with global supply chains on things like human rights, on deforestation, and so forth. But we're also looking at sort of improving the sustainability of agriculture in carbon removal certification. Regenerative agriculture is high on the agenda. So there's a lot coming in the coming years. And I really invite you also to have a look at that because it's going to be also influencing the international discussions. Maybe just to finalize, next year there will be a proposal for a legal framework on sustainable food systems here in the EU, which will set the legal basis for food sustainability. So also that is a very important one to look at. It will also set the parameters on minimum mandatory requirements for sustainability. So you may no longer be able to export your product into the EU if you do not meet certain minimum sustainability requirements. So this is an important one where we are obviously very much interested in. Just to conclude, I think these are unprecedented times, and I think policymakers should be aware that the food industry needs support, and these are it calls also for unprecedented measures. There are discussions here at the EU, but I think also internationally and also in Turkey, I think it's important that the food industry is being taken seriously, and the needs are absolutely very high. Sustainability is not only environmental. I think that should also be clarified because often there's a feeling that it is all about greenhouse gas emissions and so forth, but it is also the economic side and there's also the social side that needs to be taken into account. And that can go hand in hand. We have to find the right balance, the right way on ensuring food security, which is absolutely critical, but also making our food system sustainable, and then making sure that there's a profit for the farmers, for the producers, the processors, and other parts of the chain. Our key recommendation for policymakers in that regard is consider the food sector as a priority sector. We are a strategic asset, whether you are in Turkey or whether you are elsewhere. and help us to enable this transition. And for that, there are 3 different levers that are of critical importance. We need investment by private sector, but also by the public sector. We need innovation, because we don't have all the answers yet on sustainability, but also on the kind of crisis that we are feeling today. And we need to work together in partnership, because if we do not work together and start sort of a better collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, the farmers and the manufacturers, the retail and so forth, we will not be able to be prepared for future crises, which will definitely come. So I would like to end on a positive note. I think we are optimistic that we can get out of the crisis, but we do need to do this in consultation with others, and we need to do that very quickly. And I think with that, we should be able to move towards more sustainable economic, environmental, and social systems that will help us to be there even in 30, 40, 50 years' time. Thank you very much, and wish you a very good rest of the event.